Before we write into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. March 1969. Major Andrew Callahan, U.S. Army West Point, the kind of officer who still folded his maps on the crease, sat on an ammo crate outside the operations hooch and wrote a single word in his notebook: sloppy. He didn't mean it as an insult, not exactly. He meant it the way an engineer means it when he sees a bridge built without blueprints. Callahan had spent enough time in Vietnam to learn the difference between men who looked dangerous and men who were. He'd watched Green Berets move through elephant grass like they were sliding on rails. He'd seen Force Recon Marines go from conversation to silence without anyone saying a word. He'd been briefed by rangers who could describe a valley in pure geometry, angles of fire, folds of ground, the exact places death liked to hide. And now, after an 8-hour flight and 2 more in a rattling liaison chopper, he was staring at the Australians. Their uniforms were the same color in the way old photographs were the same color: washed out, sunburned, rubbed thin. No two men seemed to match. One wore a faded jungle jacket with a sleeve patched in mismatched cloth. Another had his trousers cut short and stitched back together like someone had done surgery with a bayonet. Their boots looked wrong, not standard issue, not polished, not even consistent. Some were slit down the side and laced back up with cord. Their webbing was a tangle of tape and paracord and improvised knots that would have earned a lecture in any American barracks. Their weapons didn't calm him either. They weren't bad weapons, just altered. Magazines taped together, metal edges dulled, shiny parts painted over, stocks wrapped in cloth. Everything looked like it had been modified by someone who cared less about regulation and more about a single narrow question: will this get me killed in the jungle? Callahan glanced at his aide as if the younger man might translate. "This is what we flew here for?" he said quietly. Sergeant Terry O'Brien, Australian SASR, lean as a cane pole, face creased from sun and sleep deprivation, had heard that tone before. Every American visitor arrived with the same expression: confusion, then contempt disguised as curiosity. Callahan just didn't bother disguising it. O'Brien didn't argue. He didn't defend his men. He didn't explain their gear or their methods or their ugly little habits. He only said, "Major, let me show you something." And he offered an experiment so simple it sounded like a joke. Callahan would walk a short distance, just beyond the wire, along a strip of jungle that began where the base ended. Normal pace, standard American field kit. The Australians would stand with their backs turned. They would simply listen. Callahan accepted immediately. He was confident in his own competence. He'd done jungle lanes. He'd led patrols. He knew how to place his feet and keep his breathing quiet, how to avoid snagging vines and snapping branches. The jungle was not magic. It was terrain. He stepped off. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The air was thick, wet, and alive with insects. The undergrowth pressed close. Somewhere in the green, something clicked and chirped. Callahan moved forward, careful, controlled. Then O'Brien's hand went up. "Stop," he said. Callahan had made it perhaps 30 meters. The Australians turned around slowly, as if they expected to see a man carrying a bell. O'Brien said, "Now, let's count." He didn't lecture. He didn't raise his voice. He simply listed what they had heard, one item at a time, the way a witness lists details at a coroner's inquest. The tiny scrape of a metal buckle against rifle stock. The soft, regular whisper of stiff fabric rubbing with each step. The heavy, flat thud of American issue boots compressing damp earth. A faint clink from something hanging inside his shirt. A plastic tap, canteen lid against canteen body, each time his hip shifted. A brief rattle as a half-empty magazine moved in its pouch. The soft creak of leather where the holster bent with his stride. The tiny sigh of a strap sliding along nylon. A momentary click where a snap fastener kissed its mate. Then more and more. Things Callahan hadn't known could be loud until someone listened for them with the patience of a predator. O'Brien stopped counting at a number that made Callahan's throat tighten. 20-something, O'Brien said, letting the idea settle. In 30 meters. Callahan opened his mouth, then closed it. O'Brien nodded toward the jungle beyond the wire, beyond the cleared lanes, beyond the safe geometry of the base. "Out there," he said, "a Viet Cong listening post doesn't need to see you. They learn the rhythm of your kit. They learn what Americans sound like. Before you've even thought the word ambush, they're already tracking you by noise." Callahan looked down at his gear as if it had betrayed him. It was all standard, designed by engineers, signed off by committees, tested in places where the jungle was a concept and not an organism. It had been built to last, to be durable, to be efficient for supply chains. No one had built it to be silent. For the first time since arriving at Nui Dat, Callahan didn't write anything. He shut his notebook like a man closing a door he'd assumed would always be open. O'Brien watched him, expression unreadable. "That's just the easy part," O'Brien said, because noise discipline, humiliating as it was, wasn't the most unsettling thing Callahan was about to witness. The most dangerous tool the Australians had wasn't a weapon, it was a person. Callahan's mind went where American minds went in 1969. Technology, some classified device, a new sensor, something hidden away in a crate with a stenciled label, and a lieutenant guarding it with paperwork. The Australians were producing results that made American intelligence officers squint at their maps and swear. Patrols were finding enemy units that aerial reconnaissance and ground sensors had missed. They were walking into the jungle and coming back with coordinates, names, and patterns of movement that American battalions had bled for without ever touching. There had to be a secret. Callahan asked O'Brien directly. O'Brien said, "All right, I'll introduce you." The man's name was Billy Wirra, from the far north of Australia, quiet as smoke. He was slight, almost delicate looking in a way that seemed impossible out here. He wore no visible rank and carried almost nothing. A canteen, a small pack, a knife that looked older than the war. His eyes moved over the perimeter with the calm ease of someone who never felt lost, because lost was a modern concept, something that happened when you stopped listening to the world. Callahan watched him with polite skepticism. Then O'Brien suggested another demonstration. A training patrol had moved through a practice trail earlier that morning. Callahan wasn't told how many men, what direction, or when. He wasn't even told what footwear they'd worn or whether they'd tried to hide their spoor. Billy wasn't told anything at all. They walked to the trail. The jungle stood there, indifferent. Billy stepped onto the earth as if he were stepping into a conversation already in progress. He didn't scan like an American scout, left to right, near to far, checking for broken branches and disturbed leaves. Instead, every few meters he paused, tilted his head, and breathed in through his nose. Once he crouched and pressed his palm flat against damp ground, holding it there longer than felt reasonable. To Callahan, it looked like superstition, a man performing a ritual. Then Billy spoke without drama, without flourish. 16, he said, went that way. He nodded northwest. Few hours. One's carrying extra weight. 2 maybe. One of them's not stepping right. Favoring. Callahan looked at O'Brien with an expression that said, "Come on." O'Brien gestured to the instructors. They checked the log. 16 men had run the lane. They'd passed through earlier that morning. 2 had carried extra ammunition loads as part of the exercise. 1 had a knee injury and had been limping, trying to mask it, failing. Billy had been right, not approximately, not vaguely, right in the way that makes a trained officer feel the ground shift under his own certainty. Callahan had seen trackers before. Vietnamese scouts, American soldiers with specialized training, men who could read boot prints and bent grass. Those were skills, teachable, testable, replicable. What Billy did didn't feel like a skill. It felt like a different relationship with the physical world, something developed over a lifetime in country where reading the land wasn't an ability, it was survival. Finding water, finding shade, knowing where the wind would change, knowing where a man could disappear and where he couldn't. The Viet Cong had spent years learning how to defeat American machines. They fooled sensors, they bypassed tripwires, they misled dogs. They studied American patterns with the cold patience of people fighting a richer enemy. But they hadn't trained for a man who could press his hand into the earth and hear time. Callahan sat with that for a long moment. Back in his notebook, he drew a hard line through sloppy and wrote something else beneath it. I don't know what, I don't know. He didn't realize how quickly that sentence would become a warning. 2 days later, Patrol Echo received its orders. When Callahan saw the operational map, he thought at first he was looking at a mistake. Someone had placed the markers wrong, shifted the objective into the wrong grid square. 5 men, deep into enemy territory. No armored support, no quick reaction force waiting to charge in if things went wrong. The insertion point was deliberately far from the target, so far that the sound of the helicopter would be connected to nothing that mattered. They would walk for days just to reach the area they actually cared about. 10 days in the bush. Callahan did the math the way officers do when they're trying not to show fear. The enemy regiment in that sector could put hundreds of fighters into the trees if it wanted. American battalions had swept those jungles and come out with casualties and frustration. The enemy lived there like fish lived in water, and the Australians were sending 5 men with stripped gear and quiet boots to go find the heart of it. Callahan couldn't keep his mouth shut. He pulled the Australian commander aside and said what he was thinking. "This isn't reconnaissance," he said. "This is 5 men signing their own death warrants." The commander looked at him with something like tired patience. Then he said, "You blokes are always hunting the enemy." Callahan waited for the rest. The commander gave him the rest in a sentence that felt like a riddle. "We found it works better if we let the enemy find us." That was all. No elaborate briefing room explanation, no doctrinal talk, just that. Callahan wrote it down because he didn't know what else to do with it. He watched Echo Patrol gear up. He watched them check each other's kit with hands that moved in practiced silence. He watched them slip out through the perimeter like ghosts, their packs low and close, their weapons dull and functional. Then the jungle swallowed them. For 3 days, nothing happened. Callahan could track the patrol only by brief coded radio bursts, tiny confirmations of life, nothing more. Each morning he studied the map, tracing possible routes through terrain marked with warnings and question marks. The Australians moved slowly, mostly at night, freezing often, becoming part of the bush during daylight, buried under leaves, mud, shadow. On the 4th day, the tone changed. Not in the words, there were no words. In the pauses, in the cadence, in the way a living thing communicates danger without naming it. Later, Callahan learned what had happened. Billy had found it first, a patch of disturbed earth on a game trail. The others had stepped over it without noticing anything odd. Billy crouched, touched the soil, and held still for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Not theirs." O'Brien asked him what he meant. Billy pointed at the subtle sign. The track was fresh, but wrong. The person who made it had been walking backward, laying heel first to suggest movement in the opposite direction. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't accidental. It was professional. It meant someone had found their trail and was feeding information back to a unit moving to intercept them. Echo Patrol was being hunted. Callahan imagined that moment in his mind like a film reel, because his own doctrine would have made the next step step automatic. Abort. Call for extraction if possible. Withdraw before the noose tightened. Any American commander would have done it without shame. Compromised mission, unacceptable risk, go home alive. O'Brien chose the other path. He ordered them deeper. And then, this was the part Callahan struggled to believe. He ordered them to start leaving traces. Not obvious signs, not broken branches like breadcrumbs, something subtler, small imperfections, a scuffed patch of earth, a vine disturbed at shoulder height, the suggestion of movement that only an expert tracker would notice, and only after careful searching. They weren't running, they were baiting. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Let the enemy tracker follow, let him report, let the pursuing force assemble with confidence, thinking it had a clean line on 5 men, then draw them into ground O'Brien had already chosen. The last step of the plan was the one Callahan couldn't make himself write down without his hand tightening around the pencil. Because the Australians intended to call artillery frighteningly close, closer than American doctrine would ever allow, trusting a battery of New Zealand gunners to put steel exactly where it needed to go, not somewhere over there. Exactly. By day 5, the jungle tested them. A Viet Cong scout emerged from the undergrowth so close to O'Brien's hide that Callahan later heard the story and felt his own stomach drop. The scout moved with slow confidence, scanning shadows, checking angles, looking for that single mistake, breath, blink, a twitch of cloth that turned camouflage into a corpse. He stopped near O'Brien, stood there. 40 seconds, O'Brien later said, an eternity measured in heartbeats. What saved him wasn't a gadget. It wasn't even the camo. It was stillness. Absolute, committed, almost inhuman. The kind of stillness that isn't just physical but mental, the suppression of every reflex that screams move when danger is within arm's reach. The scout scanned and moved on. O'Brien didn't move for a long time after that, not because he had to, because he couldn't afford not to. By day 6, the trap was set. Echo Patrol dug into a small rise. Nothing dramatic, just a piece of ground that offered angles and concealment. O'Brien watched through gaps in foliage as the response assembled below. Not a handful of curious scouts, a serious force, men spreading out with purpose, a machine gun team setting a position, a flanking element moving wide. The enemy had confidence, the kind confidence that comes from believing you're about to crush something small. Then the radio failed. Humidity is a quiet killer. It gets into everything. It eats metal from the inside. The battery contacts corroded. The handset gave only dead air. With the enemy closing, the patrol was cut off from the one thing their entire plan depended on. The radio operator scraped the terminals with a knife like a man trying to start a fire in the rain. Shots cracked through the tree line. Vegetation exploded into shredded green. The machine gun opened up, chopping the hillside with a sound like tearing canvas. O'Brien pressed into the dirt and listened, not to the gunfire, but for the moment when the world would change. Then the radio gave a burst of static, thin and ugly and miraculous. O'Brien didn't waste it on poetry. He gave coordinates. He gave urgency. Far away, across miles of jungle, New Zealand gunners did what they had been trained to do. Trust the voice on the other end. The enemy closed. Grenades started to land, dull thumps, scattering dirt and leaves. The assault came within a distance that would have made an American officer scream too close. And then the sky fell. The first rounds landed in a pattern that made no sense until Callahan later saw the aftermath. A curve of explosions, a violent line drawn across the slope like a hand slamming a door. For several minutes, the gunners walked their fire with terrible precision. Not randomly, not somewhere on that hill. They shifted it like surgeons shifting a blade, cutting the enemy force apart, forcing men into panic and ground that offered no safety. Inside his hole, O'Brien called adjustments through noise that wasn't heard so much as felt. In the chest, in the teeth, in the bones. When it stopped, the silence was not peace. It was shock. The hillside below them was torn open. Smoke drifted between trees. The enemy force that had come to crush 5 men had been broken into dead, wounded, and scattered survivors running blind. Echo Patrol climbed out, deafened, coated in dirt, shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. One man had a minor wound. Nothing that stopped him. That was all. Callahan, miles away, heard the report and didn't believe it until the next piece arrived. O'Brien didn't withdraw. He pointed into the jungle where the survivors fled. They followed. Because broken soldiers run towards something. Shelter, leadership, safety. And in doing so, they reveal what they were protecting. For the next few days, Echo Patrol shadowed the remnants through thick country, silent and patient, never close enough to be seen, never far enough to lose the thread. The enemy survivors, demoralized, scared, trying to get back to the familiar, became unwilling guides. On the final day, O'Brien transmitted coordinates that made intelligence officers sit up like men waking from a bad dream. Not just a camp, not just a cache. A nerve center, bunkers, supply points, defensive positions, enough to explain why the sector had been a bleeding mystery for so long. The following morning, aircraft struck those coordinates. The jungle shook with a different kind of thunder. Whatever had lived there did not live there afterward. When the extraction helicopter finally returned, Callahan was waiting on the tarmac. The rotors kicked dust and heat into his face. He squinted as 5 men stepped off, gaunt, hollow-eyed, uniforms fused to them by sweat and grime until cloth and flesh looked like the same material. They moved differently than when they'd left, not weaker, stripped down, purely functional, No wasted motion, no unnecessary anything. The helicopter crew turned away from the smell. Callahan didn't. He thought about the word he'd written on day one, the certainty he'd carried through years of service, and the clean logic of a West Point education. He thought about how easily he'd dismissed men because they didn't look like the picture in his head. He walked up to O'Brien and extended his hand. O'Brien looked at Callahan's clean uniform, looked at his own filthy hand. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He shook once, nodded, and walked toward the showers. 3 days later, he was back in the jungle. Callahan returned to the Americans with a report that was the most honest document he had ever written. He described noise discipline in language that made quartermasters uncomfortable. He described tracking in a way that made training officers feel small. He described artillery trust, how men survived because they believed other men, far away, would not miss. He recommended changes, immediate changes. He thought the system would be grateful. The system was proud. The report disappeared into filing cabinets and quiet conversations, and the soft, expensive silence of institutions that don't like being told they're wrong. The war dragged on. Years later, Callahan heard, through the same underground channels where soldiers traded real information, that copies of his report had resurfaced in the hands of men building new units, men searching for methods that worked in the dark places where maps failed. He couldn't prove what happened next. History rarely gives you clean lines, but he knew this much. The next generation of special operators moved differently, quieter, lighter, less obsessed with looking correct and more obsessed with staying alive. They treated sound as a threat. They treated the ground like a source of truth. They trusted precision from far away. Callahan kept his notebook from Vietnam, not because he was sentimental, because he needed the reminder. On the first page, the original word was still there, crossed out so hard the paper had nearly torn. Sloppy. Beneath it, written later in steadier hand, was the only lesson that mattered. I was looking at the future. I just didn't know it yet.